Good morning, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. I'm joined by a very special guest on this episode 129. Believe it or not, we're 129 episodes in. I'm joined by political scientist Aaron Good, and I completed reading his book last week, which is entitled American Exception, Empire and the Deep State. Two topics of very strong interest on this particular YouTube channel because we talk about these conceptualizations a lot, but it's great to have someone on that's written and published extensively about it. He also has a podcast of the same name, American Exception. And I urge my subscribers and my followers to also go over to his channel and follow him on X and all of his platforms as well. I'm going to link all the information in the episode description. And I also want to give a shout out to Matt T. Witt, who's been on the show several times, who kind of facilitated this encounter between me and Aaron. And I just want to say thanks for accepting the invitation and welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you very much for having me.
Yes, just a slight ad before we get started. We have quite an international audience, and this book, American Exception, is going to touch on a lot of the international relationships that the U.S. has, and kind of how this idea of the deep state has grown over the decades. And we have a lot of different generations that may not know about these historical occurrences, but these things are important to keep in mind when we think about this idea of the deep state. 48% of the audience is outside of the United States, which is going to generate a lot of interest. We have about 50-50 split between the audiences. And that was always the point of Kiko's Freethinkers Forum, to make this an open forum, different ideologies. We don't subscribe to a particular ideology. We have different types of people on, political scientists, professors, on-the-ground activists, third-party candidates, the whole 9 yards. There's a little bit for everyone here. We're going to also offer free Spanish lessons in the coming months. And so this is really a forum for the public. We don't censor anybody. We embrace everyone with open arms. And we really hope that the audience is getting enjoyment out of these conversations, these important, informative conversations. And the civility, we kind of have to get to the civility of the matter in these polarizing political times. I guess my first question for Aaron, it's touched on in the book some, but before we get into like the conceptualization of the deep state and stuff, I'm just curious to know your opinions about the Cold War, because that's something that you do talk a lot about in the book. Did the Cold War ever end? Like, where do you stand when people ask you that question?
I've come to conclude, and I don't know how explicitly I say it in the book, but it's something I pretty much thought in the book at the time that I was writing it, that the Cold War was more of a cover story for global empire. That after World War II, the U.S. consolidated global and centralized management over global capitalism. And so these former Western empires, colonial empires around the world, the U.S. pressed for decolonization. Okay, and this was the U.S. way of saying we're not an empire, because that's always been part of the U.S. myth, is that we were born out of resistance to empire, and we're not an empire. But of course, it was an imperial and business venture from the very beginning, with the Massachusetts Bay Company and the Virginia Company and so on. And they practice imperialism when they land. They begin expropriating and exterminating the local population, the indigenous population. And they do that fighting wars with other European countries, or with the Mexican-American War, or buying land from the French, but that's still dealing with Western imperialism. And also then they have to go on and exterminate, the Indians that live there, or halfway assimilate them. Or, I mean, we know the history of the Indians. But it was always an empire. And that kind of fundamental duplicity of the U.S. is there right at the beginning. And it's these contradictions that I think are why we're so crazy today, that we're not an empire. We are a resistance to empire, while they are systematically practicing empire. So they're fundamentally contradictory. And there's this talk of course, freedom is another part of the mythology, but of course there is slavery going along with that builds a lot of the material foundations of the U.S. economy and U.S. capitalism. Additionally, the opium trade was not just the British were involved in that, but a lot of Americans, and that was some of the early foundations of American capitalism. So it's always been a pretty brutal enterprise, but it made America really powerful. and it had the ability, or had a choice at the end of the 1800s, whether to, now that it had gone from sea to shining sea, whether it was going to be a country that would try to that it would, whether it would remain a continental power, a continental country with its own domestic economy focused mostly on domestic production and consumption, or whether they would try to follow in the footsteps of the Europeans and go abroad. They go abroad. They fight the Spanish-American War. They enter into World War One, eventually for financial reasons largely, and they enter into World War Two, and they defeat the Axis powers. But the Axis powers were really like kind of satellites of the West in some ways. They were really backed by the
Mhm.
West and so on, and they seemed like the West was backing them in part to crush Soviets, crush communism, which the West and the oligarchs of the West really feared. So that brings us to World War II, and in the aftermath of World War II, the U.S. enters the war. They planned to enter the war, and they thought that they would win because they were the most powerful industrial country in the world, and they do win. And at the end of the war, they're the most powerful country by far, the most powerful country in relative terms in human history. I mean, relative to the rest of the world. They're the only major power who was undamaged by World War II. Their industrial base was intact. They were the producer of over 50% of the world's goods. They had more than half the world's gold. They were unassailable, and they had a monopoly on the nuclear bomb. They controlled the world currency that emerged, okay, that was to be used in the capitalist world. The US dollar was the reserve currency. So the US was in an extremely powerful position, but I think that they understood to make it work, they really couldn't incorporate Russia, the Soviet Union, into their plan because they had a communist country and they didn't want to trade with them, and they didn't want other countries to be able to trade with them, especially the Europeans, but also the Japanese and those countries over there that are supposed to be sort of encircling the communist world, the capitalist outposts in East Asia. So the Cold War is an excuse for the U.S. to intervene anywhere in the world covertly. They rationalize this to themselves. They create a CIA to carry out covert operations because they, as much as they want to pretend that they're for law and democracy and so on, they aren't. When it comes down to it, they'll murder leaders, overthrow them, overthrow elected leaders, and they'll rationalize it by saying that they're fighting communism. But the giveaway that it really wasn't about communism in the bigger picture is that when the Cold War ends, the policies don't change at all. They only become more aggressive without any sort of counterweight. So and they start articulating it expressly, that they want to go for global dominance at the end of the Cold War. And even though there's some resistance in the U.S. establishment, the people that want to go for global dominance, a unipolar empire, they win out. And those elements were always present in the U.S. hive mind, the sort of corporate funded hive mind that decided that we should go for global empire and basically rule the capitalist world. They you know they were just bent on global dominance and wanting to assure that there would be no challenge to American Western power, corporate power. And it's been that way for centuries. And now finally, the empire has, created enough opposition to itself that it's weakened. But the Cold War is a huge part of this story, and it's how the world recovered after a massive world war. It was really cataclysmic, and they pretended to have decolonization and liberation, but we really are finding that that wasn't the case because they needed to be liberated from Western imperialism. The rest of the world did. And that process is, I think, what we are seeing now. And it's a very messy and kind of scary thing because we don't know. Every day there are things happening in two parts of the world that could conceivably lead to nuclear exchanges in short order while we're doing whatever that day, while we're doing the laundry, anything. The bombs could start flying. And that's because this is the end of centuries of the most powerful empire with this huge nuclear arsenal, and they don't want to accept that the world has moved on and that they can't really continue ruling the world the same way that they have for centuries. And it's an awakening for, for the white world, the Western world, whatever we want to call it. I mean, I think like whiteness is kind of an invention of the West, and especially in the U.S., it was a lot of people, it was this false sort of thing, and it's really useful, like it was for the planter class in the South. It's whiteness as a concept, or Western supremacy as a concept, is very useful in terms of creating the political hierarchies that serve the people that have the most power in the world and wealth. But it's kind of crumbling apart, and it's a moment of great change. It's exciting and a little scary.
I tell you, it's just puzzling to me the whole. And thanks for your exposition. Talking about the Cold War and just how you got to that conclusion that I share as well. Um, I kind of question. When we talk about the chronology, do things ever actually end? It's kind of like the question: do wars actually end? Because once you start ones, do they actually finish? Because you see the consequences after the technical end of something, but it's like the legacy continues. And this military complex that Eisenhower's, I think his speechwriter coined this term, maybe, or at least he developed this whole idea around it. He made it more popular, the reference about the military industrial complex. And you talk about the NSC 68, which I'm sure we'll get into. But it's almost like the West conveniently uses Russia as it's almost like a litmus test of geopolitics, because it's clear to me that Russia is not a part of the West anymore, if it ever was. It's Eurasia, but there's so many different interests in Russia. It's not just Europe, it's Asia, and then the ideological component is something that I just can't grasp, because on the one hand, it's almost like the West treats Russia like it's still part of the Soviet Union. I mean, you still have NATO. NATO, the whole point of NATO was to disband the Soviet Union. So why do we still have NATO if there's no Soviet Union anymore? That technically ended in '91 with all the different socialist republics. Um, and then on top of that, you have this site. You cited this statistic: 26.6 million people, like Soviets, died, and they took the brunt of Nazi Germany. Like they took that on the face. I mean,
Yes.
and it's like, what did they get in return for that? You would think that there would be better relations between the West and Russia. I mean, as much as we talk about Nazis and fighting against the Nazis, well, why come the Soviets don't get that kind of credit? Is it just simply the communistic element that they instill? It's just a very perplexing phenomenon, if you ask me.
Right. Yeah. It's two things, and one of them would be obvious. It's the communist part of it. But even if you remove that, Russia presents a real problem for the the American and British imperialists, because Russia, the idea of the integrated, commercial empires of the U.S. and Britain before them as the original one, is that these countries have to engage in world trade, and so the U.S. and Britain can try to dominate trade in the most lucrative areas, like the slave trade for a long time for Britain, and opium, and oil. In the twentieth century, especially, this is the way that they want to plan their geopolitical strategy. Russia, because it's so huge and has all these huge resources, and Eurasia in general, because the areas around it are pretty much unexploited, a lot of it by industrialism. um, they present a real challenge to the Western thinkers, the imperialist strategists of the West. And so the Iron Curtain was a part of the way that this was dealt with. They were just like, you're not going to trade with us. We're going to create the rest of this world, and outside of your immediate sphere of influence, which we pretty much had to concede because you had liberated yourself from Nazi Germany, and in so doing ended up occupying all of these countries. And the Soviets, for good reason, felt that these countries could not be hostile. They could not have hostile governments on their borders, because they just fought a war and lost 26 million people fighting against invasion from the West. And so this is fundamental to the same issue of Ukraine. So this geographical and civilizational part of Russia, the fact that Russia is a coherent nation and that it has all of these resources at its disposal, it's really a lot of accidents of history that they were in these two disastrous world wars. and then had an economic war, a dirty war essentially fought against it, against the West after World War II. I mean, Russia has had to overcome a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's the year after we nuke Japan, and there's the surrender of the Japanese, which was really done because of more so because of the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. They had actually wiped out um, the last bastions of Japan's overseas empire in World War II in the immediately before the dropping on the bomb in Nagasaki. And all they really talked about, as I understand it, at the cabinet meeting where they discussed Nagasaki, or the same day, was the disaster of the Manchurian campaign. So we have a false history of the bomb ending the war when it really didn't. It was really more of a way to get Japan to surrender to us so that we could preserve their oligarchy, which we did, and to frighten the Soviet Union. And the next year, in 1946, the U.S. is threatening to nuke their supposed ally, saying, if you don't leave Iran, then we're going to nuke you. And that's basically so Iran could go back to being dominated by Britain, not so Iran would be free, quote unquote. So there's that aspect of it, and then there's the communist side of it as well. The fact that the ruling oligarchy, the U.S. is just dominated by corporate power, by organized money, by capitalist oligarchs, and the whole political economy, it's a capitalist political economy. And what I think history has shown us is that, I mean, these decades that we've lived through and that preceded us show that there's really very little way to organize against capitalism in a capitalist society, because to do anything requires money, and
Mm-hmm.
the people with money, if they have enough money to be able to influence, to build institutions, then they are people who benefited from the system, and they're not going to want to challenge it. You realize, once you're a real critic of this imperialist capitalist system, that you really have very little institutional support for anything. But if you are a flack of the right for some way, or for corporate liberalism or whatever, then there is a whole constellation of institutions, academic ones, think tanks, media outlets, and so on. So it's on the one hand, you could look at all these exploitative and criminal and murderous practices that I point to and think, gosh, how could that persist? It's so obviously motivated by greed and lust for power, and there's so much duplicity involved. And how can they possibly get away with this year after year? But then they control basically everything, and they've controlled all the institutions that socialize everyone, the educational system, and so on. People just cannot see. Uh, they cannot look at their own their own social cosmology in an objective way. People are just products of the thinking of the environments they're raised in. And that's why. But I think it's the rest of the world is really where the action is, because we're so paralyzed politically, and we're so politically impotent. We just the most we can do is talk about it. But the rest of the world is catching up, and Russia is a part of that story. The fact that Russia would not be accommodated or bullied into total submission forced the U.S. into policies that ended up strengthening the opposition to the U.S. and ended up accelerating the inevitable decline of the U.S. empire, which was going to end, because all empires end.
Before we segue into the formulation of the deep state, what you theorize as tripartite state, and basically the subsequently, we can maybe discuss the assassination, the recent assassination of Trump, and kind of examine the JFK assassination, especially in comparison to that. And I mean, we've had lots of recent assassinations, relatively recent. Haniyeh, the Hamas leader, basically a week and a half ago. And then you had Abe Shinzo, the former prime minister of Japan. He was assassinated in 22. Actually, on my birthday, July the 8th, 2022, he was assassinated. And then you had Lumumba that was assassinated. So you've had all these assassinations through different parts of our history. But before we get into the complex and stuff, the military complex and all that encompasses the deep state, I'm just curious, because I posed this question to S.L. Canton who's a geopolitical commentator based out of Bangalore, India. And he talks a lot about multipolarity. You mentioned it a lot in your book, unipolarity, how the US is so unipolar and isolationist compared to the rest of the world. Does the BRICS Plus, um, in your opinion, curtail any efforts of this World War III that keeps coming up? And because it's a completely different model, it goes against the military model that you illuminate in the book. Do you think that BRICS Plus actually does it have legs to stand on? I guess ultimately, when it comes to this powerful military industry and economy that we have.
I believe so. I believe that the future is with what they are attempting to do. I said that all empires fall, and I think that between Russia and China, especially, I think that there's a kind of international statesmanship emerging, and we're so trained in the U.S. that even if we're critics of U.S. foreign policy, that we somehow feel obligated to say that I denounce, Russia's leader, and I am against X, Y, and Z going on in China and so on. And I think it's pretty tedious, and a little silly at this point. It involves often accepting Western caricatures of these other countries, and it also involves a kind of imaginary uh, version of the U.S. where it's like not the headquarters of global villainy. It's just maybe it could do a little better here or there, right? But the truth is we have global aspirations, and we're involved everywhere around the world, and the by the empire's fruits we shall know it, and that really we can see the disaster of every place that we've had more influence. I mean, in all the countries and regions of the world where U.S. power has held sway, they have not benefited. Arguably, Europe has been prosperous, but they were part of the first world. They weren't called the first world for nothing, part of the white world, and so on. But Africa, the development of Africa has been stunted on purpose by the West and the U.S. since the end of World War II. Countries in Southeast Asia, Latin America. I mean, the legacy is horrendous. We don't need to try to get into it now. But the rest of the world has always. I mean, I don't want to try to like enumerate everything because we could be here all day. But the rest of the world has, in different ways, pushed back against Western imperialism, and you could trace it. One way to look at it is like think of Ho Chi Minh, and he
Mm-hmm.
at the end of World War I, he goes to Versailles, and he rents a tuxedo, and he tries to speak to Woodrow Wilson about ending French domination of Indochina, and he is rebuffed. And then he ends up fighting on the side of the Allies in World War II against the Japanese. And at the end of that, and he models this Vietnamese state partly on the Declaration of Independence and so on. He's a person who has admires Americans and approached Harry Truman and said, "Could you allow us to be liberated from the French?" They don't do it. So eventually they have to fight and win their war, and that's how Vietnam ultimately gets its independence from the French and then from the U.S. But in between that time, I guess after the end of World War II, you had other countries like Indonesia, India with Nehru, Nasser in Egypt, if I didn't
Mm-hmm.
say that, Sukarno in Indonesia, and Nasser in Egypt, especially Nehru in India, Tito after he splits with the Soviet bloc. They're part of this non-aligned movement. They meet in Bandung, and then they go on to form the non-aligned movement. And they want to the term "the third world" is popularized by Sukarno at this time, who says there's the first world, which is the West, the white imperial powers, and then the second world are these communist states. But we want to be a third world, where we are in a third world, and we want to be separate. We don't want to be. We want to find our own way. And they were crushed through coups, and Nasser dies. The Israel invades in 1967, and then he dies a few years later. Some people think he may have been poisoned. The You have Sukarno is overthrown. They try to assassinate Sukarno, but they overthrow him, and they slaughter like maybe 1, 2, 3 million Indonesian peasants to make that happen. So the non-aligned movement kind of fizzles out. But by the 1970s, inspired by OPEC, which was ironically probably more of a Western, scheme, even though it appeared to be like these Arabs banding together and oil producers banding together, it redounded to the benefit of the U.S. and was probably instigated by them. But these other countries, they wanted to follow that model with commodities in the third world, and so they went for this new international economic order that they were calling for. But the economic problems of the 70s, especially the US, just raising interest rates after loaning these countries a bunch of money, they then raise interest rates and then basically bankrupt these countries, and then the IMF and US can pick over their bones. That happens in the 80s and 90s. And beginning from the Volcker shock in the 1970s. So the third world just keeps getting beaten down by Western imperialism. And at the end of the Cold War, Gorbachev was really wanting to join with the U.S. in partnership in a different kind of a world. He was calling for something more like what the BRICS are calling for: a multipolar world, third world debt relief, and a way to organize international trade that would be more equitable for everyone. But the U.S. really the U.S. was involved in the crash of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Soviet Union. They indebted a lot of Eastern European countries on purpose. They promoted these liberal civil society organizations in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. They drew the Soviets into a disastrous war in Afghanistan. They turned Afghanistan into the headquarters of global heroin production, and they flooded the Soviet Union with heroin. They crashed the price of oil when the oil revenues are what Gorbachev needed to sort of reorganize the economy, and then they crashed the price of oil to the lowest level. It was just disasters for the Soviet Union, and a lot of it was the result of what you can call hybrid war from the West. But Gorbachev at the end was also calling for, like, let's have a new kind of situation in the world. The U.S. wouldn't hear it, and they used the end of the Cold War and the chaos of the Cold War to basically loot Russia financially, and they created a class of oligarchs in Russia
Mm.
that were really beholden to the Western interests until Putin, although he was Yeltsin's successor, somehow ends up being the anti-Yeltsin, and he stands up to a lot of these forces, and he doesn't expropriate them, so he's not a communist or anything like that. If you're a leftist like me, you'd think like, gosh, I think the oligarchs' holdings should probably be nationalized, but he didn't really do that. But he did in some industries. They nationalized the oil industry, and they have nationalized the weapons industry. And everything that we hear about Russia is that, oh, they're so corrupt, and it's a mafia state run by Putin, and he's the richest man in the world. But if you look at it in the abstract, I mean, if you just look at it, the living conditions for Russians have risen enormously under his leadership, under the time that he's been in office. So, the idea, if you're a corrupt leader and you're enriching yourself at the expense of the people, but he has improved living standards and development in Russia to a huge degree. So this has caused him to confront the U.S. and the fact that there's Russia and that China's economy became as powerful as it did. This has changed the balance of power. And in the 90s, after the end of the Soviet Union, the Russians and Chinese, starting in the mid 90s, started saying in their public pronouncements, we need to have a multipolar world. We need to have a world where it's not just one person calling the shots everywhere. And meanwhile, in the U.S., policymakers like Wolfowitz, his Defense Department planning guidelines in 1991 calling for basically a unipolar world, and the Project for a New American Century, they're calling for full spectrum dominance and for the U.S. to dominate every area of international politics and the militarism for the next century. That's the new American century that they want. So this is obviously a conflict. One side is saying we want global empire. We reserve the right to preempt any country that might be able to challenge us on the global stage. So this is an insane doctrine, and that's what the U.S. is espousing, while the Russians and Chinese are basically acting as the most important spokespeople for the non-Western world, saying we want a multipolar world. And the more that the U.S. has tried to stop a multipolar world from emerging, which is one way to think of those wars in Iraq and so on, control over Middle Eastern oil, the world's energy supplies, you do that and you make sure that the U.S. is in control of the global political economy. But those wars were dangerous and stupid, and they have redounded to our disadvantage, predictably, because I think we're at the stage where the people that manage the empire can't really run it right. And so the BRICS get stronger every year, and other countries like Saudi Arabia seem like they are tired of taking U.S. dictates, but they kind of had Turkey and Saudi Arabia both seem to have one foot in either camp, and it seems like they want to jump ship because they know what their people want, and they know where that in the longer run, the history, the center of history is moving away from the Washington, London, Tel Aviv axis, and it is going to be a Eurasian century, but it's more of a, you could call it a brick century, maybe. I think that's what we're headed for if the U.S. doesn't start a nuclear war that you know puts destroys all of that which people have built for centuries, for millennia, destroys human civilization potentially. That's what the U.S. might do.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. I'll tell you that. Um, I do want to definitely get into your tripartite theory, and you cited. I noticed just reading it, you refer a lot to Glennon's double government concept, and then you refer to C. Wright Mill's the whole idea of the power elite, which is it was published in 1956, was an actual work. So, how do you kind of get to your tripartite theory just from our audience, and how does this tie into this whole idea of the deep state? Because when people hear deep state, they maybe the broader public are a little confused, but we did a poll with my audience 3 or 4 months ago, and 95% of my audience believe that there is a such thing as a deep state, even though that's all I pose is the question. And so my audience is pretty, I guess, open to hearing what you have to say about your tripartite theory in this regards.
Yeah, I'll try to explain this as best I can. It was something that was kind of the core, at least the theoretical core of my dissertation, which was, about 10 years of work. But so it's something I know maybe too well for some purposes to try to talk about and summarize, but I'll do my best here to try to think of it as put on my sort of high school teacher hat in a way. Not that your audience is high schoolers, but just in terms of explaining something not taking it for granted that people have spent a bunch of time reading social science literature, because who really has? Um, the state, the idea of the state is that organization which has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence or force. Okay, like the sort of over a given territory, so that sovereign entity. And the idea of the state in the U.S. and in America is that it is democratic, and that it has to conform to the Constitution and the rule of law, and that its leading officials are chosen by the public, and so the public is sovereign. But it never really quite works that way for different reasons. It's always a pretty oligarchic society, and that's pretty well understood, even though we also have democracy. Um, but so we think of the democratic state as being the American state. Now, it didn't always work in a democratic way, especially because there was something deeper there going on. And this idea of the deep state, the term wasn't invented by Peter Dale Scott, but he more or less formulated the main counter arguments against the liberal version of the state, or the Max Weber version of the state, because he was writing about how in the 60s, beginning in the 60s and 70s is when he's starting to look into these things. There's law breaking, unadjudicated law breaking that's a part of our system of governance. And as he looks at CIA covert operations overthrowing democracies around the world, but also things like the Kennedy assassination, where the regime or the system of governance seems to have carried out this crime, and thus is able to effect a cover up, an open-ended cover up after the fact, right? That this is not something that's compatible with the idea of a democratic state. And so he starts talking about a deep political system. And he wrote a book about that called Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, and that was published in 1991. He had previously, back in the 70s, written about parapolitics, which was political practices where accountability is diminished consciously by people. So conspiratorial politics, covert operations, and so on. He kind of backed away from that when too many conspiracist-minded people embraced the idea. So, of course, we're talking about political conspiracies, but that's different from conspiracism, where you essentially think everything is to be explained by reference to conspiracies. It's Michael Parenti would talk about this in a complex way, but not too many scholars in the West. It's not something the West interrogates too deeply, especially the left in the West, but really not. I mean, the right wouldn't either. Because it's basically an understanding of the importance of political economy, the primacy of political economy in terms of understanding history and politics, and that is pretty much a materialist critique. And so it should be an analysis of the way that the regime uses clandestine violence should be something that the left would want to do. But oftentimes the left has an aversion to this. And so other people look at these criminal practices of the state and they just make it all about these conspiracies and that the state is itself a conspiracy, when it's a bit more, it's a bit different than that, I argue. So Peter wrote about the deep political system, and he wrote about how the CIA does all these things now, but even previously, before World War II, you had organized crime, which was always intertwined with the elites and the rich, and in a way functioned as a part of the system of governance, even though it was like not something that could be acknowledged or totally understood. So we always had this element of like top down or dark power, even before there was a national security state. But with World War II and the end of World War II, and the Cold War as the kind of legitimizing myth of America's global empire, and anti-communism being the sort of new state religion, you have the creation of this national security state. And it believes, operate differently from the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, because communism is just such a threat, an existential threat to everything that is good and righteous about and free in America. Communism is going to take it away. And so we have to basically create the FBI and CIA, or beef up the FBI and create the CIA and allow them to break any law under the sun to protect our freedom, because it's just so dangerous. And our enemies are not bound by laws and morality, so we cannot be either. But we're doing it. Our criminality and immorality is for a good cause. It's for the cause of freedom. It's like this ridiculous duplicity, really, and dualism of the regime, where it's freedom and democracy and all these good things, but underneath it all, ultimately, is this lawless force that is aggressively not just defending it, but kind of going out in the rest of the world and trying to take over as much as it can, like through neo-colonial means. So colonialism ends, and you get neo-colonialism. It's replaced with this new kind of political economy. But the deep state, or this other kind of secret version of the state, emerges because the U.S. can't say that it doesn't want to say we're the Fourth Reich, right? They don't want to say that. They don't want to say that we're in charge and we can break every law that we want to do what we want to do, because we're the best and we deserve to be ruling. I mean, that's basically just a reformulation of the Führer principle. When in practice, when you look at what it is, it's the rules-based order is really just the Führer principle applied internationally, where whatever we make the rules and we choose how to enforce them, and if we revise them or don't apply them to ourselves, that's our prerogative as well. That has really been the guiding U.S. Overriding philosophy or creed, even if they don't say it. And this regime itself is that's one way to think of the deep state. So the deep state, we could say, is the whole regime, the democratic state, the congressmen and so on, and the president, the people that are elected, the things that we see on TV and that we learn about in civics classes. And then there's this national security state, the FBI, the CIA, and sometimes it might have to be secretive about things, but it's supposed to protect the regime, right, or the government. But really, there's the dark power, or the oligarchic power, the top-down power is the deep state. It's the fact that it exercises such a shadow over the national security state, that it basically created the national security state, that it owns the commanding heights of the U.S. economy and all the major sectors of the U.S. economy, that it more or less formulates grand strategy among elites who are not deliberating in a public way, and that these things just get decided above the level of like what is discussed democratically or even influenceable democratically. That is pretty clear. It's top-down rule. The deep
Mm-hmm.
state is top-down rule in a nominal democracy. Okay, when you say it that way, the deep state is like basically a regime, the tripartite state regime, or the deep state regime, if you want to call it that. It's not just the government, it's all of those institutions which formally or informally control control the state, control the government. That would be one way to describe the deep state. Or the other meaning is the more narrow one, which means that sort of most secret and clandestine part of the state that answers to oligarchic power and the grand strategy of oligarchs, the oligarchy of the United States, and the oligarchy of the West, if we want to say it that way. So there's two ways to describe the deep state. One is the sort of clandestine state, which is the CIA, but not just the CIA. It's like it's all of
Mm-hmm.
its allies and organized crime and other intelligence agencies and other private outfits and everything else. And then there's the deep state, as in like the regime, the bigger the media would, you could say, is a part of the deep state. The tech monopolies are arms of the deep state. They represent oligarchic power, and their collective function is to allow for top-down rule in a nominal democracy. And because they have so much power over the economy and over our institutions, we have very little influence democratically, and so we cannot get policies that are in the interests of the majority of the people in the United States. We are more or less overawed by an oligarchy that we could say is the deep state.
That makes a lot of sense. And I tell you, reading your book, when you were kind of elucidating Glennon's whole idea of a double government, that made sense. But as you rightfully point out, that doesn't take into account all the corporations. Like it was missing that element. But the military and government, you could argue, is just like it's just government. I mean, the military is the government, really. I mean, if you want to, I guess, translate it that way. But the book seems to separate the two, I guess, because government, I guess, in a way, would be the bureaucratic structure, the leaders that you just referred to that we see on television. And then you have the military, which is probably a little bit more clandestine than that. And then you have behind that the national security state, which is really clandestine. Like most of the public is unaware of their operations. If you bring up the operations, people look at you like you're crazy, like you have two heads. But that's a frustrating component too, because you don't want to always, I guess, if you're just thinking out loud, you don't want to just assume that the CIA is behind most of this stuff. But is it that simple to say the CIA is behind all these secretive covert operations? I think that's hard for the average person to sort of think in their mind, like so how does that work out with the CIA? But like you said, um, you mentioned 668,000 civilian Defense Department employees. There's 46 governmental agencies. I think when a president gets in power, they have 3,000 people to come with them. So it's not like it's one singular entity. There's just so many different moving parts that comprise the government.
Yeah, it's difficult to wrap your mind around the way that these decisions really would get made. And as I understand it, the national security state is now so sprawling and complex that really nobody totally has a handle on the way that it all operates. And as to how these decisions get made by and who makes them, I mean, I think that the military was a bit more dangerous in the 50s and 60s and 70s. I think that they kind of got reined in more under civilian control in some ways, and they seem to go along with the war machine in general, but when you look back at things like Iraq, they seem to have been swept along by civilian actors and had kind of misgivings. Many of them did, and even many of the people in the CIA did. And yet the CIA still functioned to help to get the U.S. into that war. Um, and it's hard. So it's hard to know exactly how a lot of the system operates because it operates in secret. And what is the real locus of decision making? And my sense is that a lot of the people in the CIA believe that they are protecting the national interest, and that they're not involved in the most nefarious things that we would think of with the CIA, like assassinations and operations with drug running and so on. And it may well be the case that a lot of the operations that the CIA handled for different, because they led to scandal back in the 70s, like Air America and Iran Contra, Gary Webb stuff,
Mm-hmm.
that the drug running operations and the organized crime operations have been outsourced to, like, British or Israeli intelligence agencies, and that they may control more of those kind of mob Western intelligence operations and relationships than in the past. It's hard to say, but the U.S. There's some things to look at, like this group called Far West that kind of took over after BCCI was dismantled. You have this group called Far West, and they seem to be more Israeli linked, and they're doing a lot of the things that the old Bush, George H.W. Bush, Ted Shackley, CIA people we used to
Mm-hmm.
do. So we don't really know how this whole thing is managed anymore in terms of the clandestine part of it. It seems to still be, it's part of the U.S. empire, but I think that we have outsourced some of these networks, and they're more privatized or perhaps tied to other intelligence agencies as well. I think the British and the Israelis are probably the one culprits. People you could obviously suspect. In the past, we've used Saudi intelligence, but it seems like things have gone a little sour with the Saudis in some respects, like the way they killed Khashoggi, who was a
Mm-hmm.
intelligence connected, um, and so this it's like we still work with Turkish intelligence, and they seem to be coordinating some of our activities with ISIS and the oil theft in Syria that's been going on recently, but we don't really know precisely how that is carried out, and who makes those decisions and who ends up benefiting from it. Gary Vogler, who was in the Iraq, who was involved in Iraqi oil reconstruction and such, he wrote a book saying that it's essentially an oil smuggling operation to provide Israel with essentially stolen oil from Syria. So he has a lot of experience in these areas. So I take that seriously, but it's we don't the way that it doesn't seem that what we're doing now is in the national interest at all, even from this perspective of the U.S. empire. And that's why this issue of the deep state, who is making these decisions, it obviously isn't the result of Joe Biden thinking, oh, I think this is the policy after thinking about it carefully. This is how I should act. I mean, mostly he's just on autopilot. Like he was on autopilot, and he's telling people nothing will fundamentally change if I'm elected president, right? And then because he keeps doing the same thing and trying to make sure that nothing will fundamentally change, he's drawn into these wars, and a war and a genocide. And the war is a turkey shoot for Russia, essentially. I mean, not that they suffer no casualties, but the Ukrainians are getting far the worst of it. And in Israel, the situation is terrible as well. And it's mainly because, it's not because of what Biden necessarily did. It's that he nothing was going to fundamentally change. So the policy of NATO expansion was going to continue into Ukraine, and the full-throated support of Israel, no matter what crimes it commits, was going to continue. And because of that, things might fundamentally change a whole lot, because we are on the precipice of disaster in both places. Uh, Depending on how you want to think of it. I mean, the U.S. policy has been disastrous in terms of what its planners hope to achieve and what they're going to achieve, and we're just trying to think of what to do about this, as if we have any input anyway. But that's because we live under essentially deep state governance. We don't even know if Joe Biden is coherent. Have you heard anything from him recently? Has he done anything the
You
last few days? I haven't tried to follow it really closely, but it seems like he's really gone into hiding or something.
Well, I felt that way even when he was more visible, and the fact that they just used this switch to Kamala Harris is just crazy to me. But it just shows you how um, obsessed the public is with these politicians, these celebrities. I mean, it's they're really puppets. They don't really have any power per se, but it's just symbolic to me. And even within this so-called democracy, I mean, you have a branch that writes the bills, and then the president is there almost as a figurehead, and then you have the Senate there, which I argue a lot of times that what's the point of even having the Senate when you need 60% of them to pass the bills? Like the House is writing the bills, and then the president's just there, sitting there, watching all this stuff happen, and they're parading around the country doing whatever. But I mean, he's not even parading around the country at this point. Um, but I think that
She was more shuffling around the country for a while. I can't believe how bad he's looked for last last year.
it was always bad. I just think that the corporate media did a good job of kind of hiding these things, because you can go to any of these clips and just see like this something's wrong with him. Like you can just see it or whatever. It doesn't make any sense. It's not just stuttering. I hate that when people go to he just stutters a lot. No, it's not. Like I know my dad stutters a lot. It has nothing to do with that. There's something wrong with him up there. But it's I had a question before we get into the assassination part and the conclusion of this. And it's really more so geared towards when you hear the word foreign policy, you hear this a lot during these so-called debates on TV, these spectacles. When they have the debates on TV, which I mean, they're a fucking joke, honestly. If people even watch those debates, they're really entertainment. But for people who do watch those debates on television between the candidates, they always talk about foreign policy. My question is, when they ask the people what's foreign policy to those people, what do you think the public is thinking when they're thinking of foreign policy, and what is the actual meaning of foreign policy? What are they really trying to say to people?
Well, this issue of foreign policy is the main it's the main thing that the American political system is engaged in. It's not really a country that tries to run a functional democratic society wherein the democratic regime generally represents the best interests of the public which elected it to office. It's really foreign policy, and it's really running an empire, and it's presented as pablum to the US public. It was the Cold War back in the day, and then after that it's the America USA #1 in the 90s, and capitalism has triumphed, and corporate America is unassailable, and this is the greatest, and we've got the internet, and everything is wonderful, and America rules. And then 9/11 happens, and so they try to basically reorganize the entire political universe around terrorism. But just as with the Cold War, it was kind of a convenient myth created by figures. Our opponents all mysteriously trace back to West U.S. covert operations and to regimes that are allies or clients of the United States, like Saudi Arabia, right, where all those hijackers came from. And we know now that
Mm-hmm.
the Saudi intelligence, which has often acted as a sock puppet of the U.S., was essentially protecting them. Even the Atlantic is writing about that now, all these years later. But oh
Mm-hmm.
well, never mind. We're just going to reorient all of U.S. foreign policy around this war on terror framework, and we're going to, invade Iraq and invade Afghanistan and occupy those countries in disastrous long wars. And we knew at the time that those same people, the neoconservatives who had taken over U.S. foreign policy, were planning to invade these other countries. Wesley Clark said this around 2004, that they had plans to invade Syria, Libya, Lebanon, and so on. And
Or
I'm gonna.
one,
What's that?
2001.
Yeah, that was when they said it, and then that was when the official said that, I believe, because it was either that or it was right before the Iraq War, which would have been in 2002, and then in 2004, I think that was when he reported it or said it to Amy Goodman, something like that.
Oh, okay, I
But
got
that's
you.
the general chronologies after the 9/11 attacks. And they did basically have plans to invade all those countries. And at some point, at least we know Wesley Clark said this, but it was also contained in other reports written by these and papers written by the neoconservatives, like the Clean Break Report. And
Mhm.
there's elements of this in the Project for a New American Century documents and so on. So we knew basically what their plans were, but the foreign policy gets wrapped around these global crusades, which are really just to extend U.S. imperialism and to advance this idea of unipolarity that the neocons were so obsessed with. And this is the way our foreign policy discussions are had, but they're not. I mean, they're the people at the top are debating how America can keep ruling the world in perpetuity and basically keep being the global empire and the hegemon of global capitalism. That is not the way it's ever presented to the public. And so there's never real discussions about foreign policy. They're all completely fake, and they're based on fairy tales and just made up narratives that some sort of narrative managers have decided are the best way to present the policies that have already been decided upon to the American public. And so it really, the discussions of foreign policy are especially stupid in the United States, the mainstream discussions of them, because the truth is, for any time in recent memory, uh, the prime directive of everything the U.S. is trying to do is to dominate the world to the greatest extent possible for as long as possible, and to use whatever economic, military, cultural, political means at its disposal to make that happen. But if we were going to have that discussion, it's like we should have our presidential candidates coming out dressed like Caesar or something. It doesn't suit our democratic pretensions, and so it's all just so fake. It's so fake, and the rest of the world is, I think, grasping it more and more, and more of the public has lost faith. It's looking like, on the one hand, pressure for war is building, but I don't know how much of a real fighting force you could get for the U.S. to go to some far-flung corner of the world anymore, because nobody's going to attack the U.S. I don't think that people have enough faith in the U.S. government and the mission of the U.S. to want to join in these kinds of things anymore. And so this is where this this so-called liberal democratic global empire is just sort of is falling flat on its face, because its guiding principles are so antithetical to democracy and to the rule of law that we're just, I don't think people believe in it anymore, unless they're kind of brainwashed, which a lot of people are. But even if they are, do they believe it enough for us to be able to like create some huge military force that's going to go fight in whatever place? And I mean, if you can't fight a land war anywhere, and I don't see a land war that we could fight and win that would be actually help our situation, then you would just go nuclear, which is total catastrophe. So to me, that's the bad shape of the U.S. is frightening, because you don't know what they're going to do, but it's also encouraging, because I just don't see how it can go on this way. And so maybe at some point, to sort of get back to your original question, maybe at some point we will have actual discussions of foreign policy, because it's necessary if we're going to have any kind of democratic debate about how we got here, and then therefore what we need to do to change course. An honest discussion about foreign policy is going to need to be had, if not publicly, at least some people who are going to be running the top down regime should start to look at reality. And so maybe there's hope there that reality in some level will be discussed, whether publicly or whether among the elite. Their project has failed, and it's really marking the end of centuries of white supremacy. Western, you can trace this since Columbus sets out. Really, you could say since the Portuguese start sailing around Africa, and then the Spanish. Like this just kicked off an era where Western imperialism was the prime shaper of world history, of international history, of human history. And over that time is when every invention, like all the main technological advances of modern media and communications and everything else, arose during this period. So it's like we can't even imagine the world that's not Western dominated. It's not white supremacy in some sense, right? I mean, the two world wars are basically two civil wars of the white world. Is one way to think of it. It's like the white world fighting for who's going to be the top white dog. It was like a civil war of whiteness. But this is coming to an end because it has to. And at some point, the foreign policy is going to have to be discussed. It's going to have to be looked at like, oh, yeah, this is what happened. It was, we did try to rule the world and we didn't succeed. We had a good run and maybe we can try to cooperate with the rest of the world because now we can't really afford to fight wars. Everybody has nukes. So maybe that could end up being a good thing because we know we can't fight each other. We're going to have to cooperate.
Okay, so with respect to the assassinations, I thought it was interesting the part where, because I had never heard of this before, that JFK's own security detail was partly responsible for his assassination because the family ties. I was reading that. Did I read that correctly?
JFK's well, the security detail, the Secret Service did bungle some things, including pulling someone off of the car who wanted to ride on the back of it, and you can see him. There's video of him being exasperated, saying, "Why are you telling me not to ride on the car?" Whereas if he let him do that, then the president would have probably avoided getting shot that day, or he may have survived. And they also took the president through the through Dealey Plaza when that wasn't a good route for them to have taken, and that slow curve, the way that they took that. They didn't do a good job, as with the Trump business recently, of making sure that the areas where the motorcade was going were free of like open windows or office windows that could be dangerous. They could have put a bubble top on the top if they'd looked at the route and thought about that. But I think that the Treasury Secretary, it was the person who controlled the Secret Service at that time. I think now it's under the Department of Homeland Security, but same difference really. It's kind of still a little disturbing for the Treasury person to be like also controlling the security of the Democratic official, because it really just kind of says like, just hammers home that like money is the this is a monotheistic country, and where money is the supreme deity, and so they will protect our president. I mean, that's how I think of it. Um, but so anyway, the Treasury Secretary was a guy who was connected to the oligarchy of the U.S. His Charles Dillon was his name, and he was the part of the Dillon family, blue blood, oligarch family, who part of the Dillon Reed Investment Bank, which is like some of the same people who were powerful enough to like call for creating the CIA. So they have a lot of invested capital around the world, and the CIA could like protect their interests. And previously, the guy had been for the assassination of Lumumba under Eisenhower. This Dillon fellow had been for the Lumumba assassination. He said, "Yeah, you need to assassinate this Lumumba fellow." Because he was an African nationalist, and he really wanted to use the resources of Africa to help Africa. And people like Dillon didn't like that. Kennedy's policies were more friendly toward the third world. They were more friendly to people in countries where people like Dillon had a lot of capital invested. So their oligarchic interests were counter to what Kennedy envisioned for the world, which is really something closer to a multipolar world. When he was calling for ending the Cold War, it was a chance for the U.S. to take a different route. And there have been a number of times that people have suggested that the U.S. not pursue an imperialist path. At the end of the 1800s, there was the Anti-Imperialist League. There were people who opposed U.S. entry into World War I, like the Wobblies. There were at the end, and during World War II, the vice president was a real anti-fascist, Henry Wallace, and he was calling for the century of the common man, not an American century, but a century where American technology and industrial power could be used to help uplift the rest of the world. Something similar to what China is proposing to do with like the Belt and the Road and with the BRICS and other sort of economic arrangements, right? So he was an internationalist, but the imperialists went out. But then you have Kennedy in the 60s, and he's calling for ending the Cold War. And he is friendly to third world countries, third world leaders like Sukarno. He wanted to work with Lumumba, but they assassinated him before Kennedy even took office. And people like Dillon, who was in charge of his security, and Alan Dulles, the former CIA director, they represented Wall Street power, the same people who wanted the U.S. to go for global empire in the first place. So it was as though Kennedy was going against the dictates of the deep state, of the oligarchy, and their grand strategy for the U.S. essentially being the most dominant empire, the manager of global capitalism, And they benefited from that because they were the titans of corporate America. And if America is a global empire, then American corporations and the oligarchs who own them are the richest, most powerful people in the world. And so this is a great system for them. Kennedy was calling for more of a multipolar world of international cooperation, and that idea terrifies the owners of this country. They have used the frontier. The existence of the frontier was always a way to deal with excess capital and excess population, especially this process of imperial expansion. And they continue that even after they go from sea to shining sea. And in the early 20th century, they thought maybe we could just be more focused on domestic things. They said no. So likewise in the 60s with Kennedy, and internationalists like Dag Hammarskjöld trying to deal with problems of post-colonialism and decolonization, there was pressure for internationalism, a more kind of lawful internationalism, and a world based more on cooperation rather than just the balance of nuclear terror and free market economics. But they had a veto over that. And so they've vetoed every person that suggested that. And domestically in U.S. politics, the political assassinations of the 60s and just the whole takeover of both parties basically into two pro-corporate, pro-militarist political parties, and the media is controlled by these same forces. So that's really the whole scope of the debate is what flavor of pro-corporate militarism do you like? Do you like the sort of gauche right-wing version that's like anti-abortion, or do you like the woke democratic one that has promotes DEI tokenism and humanitarian wars, but really doesn't practice humanitarianism and has no interest in ending white supremacy or helping the bulk of people, poor people of color in the United States? Really, it's just like super tokenism and moralizing in that sort of way versus the sort of old-timey Christian moralism of the right wing. It's just it's really just a very bad puppet show for a global empire at this point. And so with the sixth Kennedy, getting back to Kennedy, he was a powerful statesman and he was channeling democratic aspirations in the United States and responding to them around the world. And for that reason, he had to be killed. Other people were doing similar things in different ways, but even Malcolm X, what he was saying about Africa and so on, even though he and Kennedy would not have seen eye to eye, and he famously said that it was the chickens coming home to roost, but he also said there's also a lot more meaning in that argument when he said that, because he explained it later. He said, when you send chickens out to the rest of the world, they come back to your farm. I know that because I'm a farm boy. Your chickens always come back to your farm, and other people's chickens go back to theirs. And these chickens we've sent out all over the world, they're coming back now. So it was a way of him saying these clandestine, dirty tricks that the U.S. is using around the world to overthrow leaders, it's come back home, which is an interesting take on it. But those people, the best leaders were systematically assassinated in the U.S. and anywhere else they arose if need be. And because the power of the people who control the political economy, which is a corporate, capitalist dominated one, have the most power to make sure that they win in political and military confrontations. And this is, the U.S. has to now had the balance of power in its favor. But as we see that those things change. And so some leader maybe that they would assassinate, maybe they ought not to assassinate because the reforms are needed. This is something I would try to emphasize.
Well, you referenced the Lumumba assassination, and you talked about that relationship that that Kennedy had. Like he looked up to Lumumba in a lot of ways, and he followed that multipolar angle more so than in comparison to the rest of the people we've had in our lifetimes. I mean, it's a very stark contrast. But you could also make the argument too. I mean, I think you talked about the Gaddafi. The way Libya was like a strong force in Africa, and look at Libya now, and what happened under the Obama administration. They basically had drone campaigns, and then they were funding the opposition with all the weapons and stuff to ultimately lead to, his
Yeah.
assassination.
Who were basically jihadis, by the way. They were like
Jihadis.
Al Qaeda types.
So, with all that in mind, is it safe to say that those assassinations were pretty much planned out? Like that's what it seems like you're saying.
Oh yeah, of course they had to have been done in all of them. I think the Malcolm X one is probably the one that is the most like the pre national security state assassinations, in that he was, because he wasn't a public official, he really didn't have security. You could basically use sort of organized crime or other private entities like the Muslim Brotherhood, to not the Muslim Brotherhood, the Nation of Islam. Um, but the Nation of Islam was getting money from people like H.L. Hunt, right wingers like H.L. Hunt, as I understand
Mm-hmm.
it, and they were useful for the right wing in a way. Like Nation of Islam is, you can see why hard right wingers would want to support the Nation of Islam, because it kind of makes it more difficult. When they're out there, they can be sort of caricatured, and it makes it more difficult to reconcile sort of anti-establishment potentially or somewhat radical white politics with this sort of militant politics of a segment of the black population of the U.S. Right? I mean, it's weird, but like they did, that was an aspect of part of, I believe this was part of what made Malcolm X unhappy, the fact that he was learning more about the finances of the whole thing. And as weird as it sounds, it's like the British Empire created the Muslim Brotherhood. So these kind of organizations of religious groups that are on the fringes are often backed by powerful people. So anyway, in that way, you could get that you could manipulate those kind of forces, and maybe not have to have the FBI or CIA involved, or maybe they were. I would guess they were on some level, but they really could farm it out and have plausible deniability. And that's why the case is still kind of confusing, the Malcolm X case. But
Mm-hmm.
you're just, the way that the police evaporated that night and everything else, it was pretty clear. MLK, there's been a lot shown about military intelligence being in Memphis at the time. You had that civil trial. There's a lot to show that the national security state was really horrified of MLK, and you understand why. Same reason, similar to RFK. In
Mm-hmm.
1968, you had Martin Luther King, the most respected, although kind of hated by the establishment by then, but this revered figure for civil rights. And he's come out against the Vietnam War, and he's railing against the evil triplets of racism, militarism, and economic exploitation. So poverty, militarism, and racism. He's saying these things are all related, and we need to confront them. And then in the political sphere, you have a viable Democratic candidate, Robert Kennedy, who is speaking as more of a pro-peace internationalist than even his brother did when his brother was president, because he's really responding to elements in American society that are more for peace and that are tired of the war and the strife, and that think back about the Kennedy years as being more optimistic. And so here's this guy, Robert Kennedy, a few years later. We also know he wanted to investigate his brother's assassination, but he's running on a platform that's just similar to MLK's critique of the three evils. He's running on a platform for economic justice, peace, and racial progress, racial reconciliation, racial justice. So, of course, he is killed. They kill Martin Luther King in April, and then in June they kill Robert
Mm-hmm.
Kennedy, and so they're able to effect really a counter-revolutionary force in the U.S. to the extent that politics can be counter-revolutionary. I mean, I think Robert Kennedy represented a real threat and wanted to take the country in a different direction, so they assassinated him, and they assassinated MLK as well. And once that happens, you've lost the activist energy for an anti-imperialist change in the United States, and then you've lost the political side. And so there's that sculpture in Indianapolis of. Have you ever seen the sculpture of RFK and Martin Luther King? It's like at the park where Robert Kennedy gave the speech the night that MLK died, and it's just the two figures are kind of reaching out to each other, but they're not able to like touch hands.
Mm.
It's sort of like it's like ghostly in a sense, but it actually works as a metaphor for the possibilities of that time, because Martin Luther King had become a quite prescient critic of the U.S., and the American public was behind, I think, what Kennedy and Martin Luther King were advocating for generally, but they're never able to achieve that. And I think the issue is this imperial regime is too powerful that you really can't, it has to run its course before it can really be changed. I think that more, and when people feel frustrated about how to change anything, you just think that, well, it's, don't we live in a very top down system. And so,
Mm-hmm.
but it has its own contradictions and is actually uh, operating in a way that isn't sustainable. And these assassinations are worth looking at so you understand what they're capable of, what they oppose, what they won't tolerate, what the limits of our democratic system are, and understand it, because ultimately they let us see the true nature of this regime that we live under. And that is important. And I think that as things fall apart, it's something to look at and maybe revisit some of those ideas that Martin Luther King had at the end of his life.
I don't know if you saw this recently, but it was like 6 days ago. They interviewed the guy that tried to kill Ronald Reagan, like the assassination attempt on Reagan. CNN did, I think.
Hinckley.
Yeah,
I didn't see the interview, but that's
Aaron
interesting.
Burnett. I didn't either. Like I had to, and I watched like 20, 30 seconds of it. I was like, are you freaking kidding me? No, no, are you fucking kidding me? Like they had this dude on to give commentary about which is it's just so crazy. This is the type of world we live in, where someone thought that was a good idea to bring somebody on to try to kill a former head of state, commenting on the potentially current head of state, or there was a former head of state himself in Trump, and I don't know. A lot of the thing with Trump was perplexing to me. Just there were eyewitness accounts of the shooter climbing, like people saw it, but no one else saw it. Like the security detail, like what were they doing? What were the local police doing? It just, and then people had their own opinions about the timing and everything else. And I polled my audience because I had taken a break from the YouTube channel, and I asked them just point blank, do you believe that this was a staged assassination attempt? And two-thirds of my audience believed that there was a staging element involved in this assassination attempt of Trump. And I don't know if that was because of political persuasion, um, influence, or what, but I gave them the options: no, unsure, likely, or very likely. And two-thirds came to the conclusion that it was staged to a certain extent. What's your whole take on it?
I mean, in a sense, my guess is as good as yours. But I guess since have studied these assassinations in depth, I should say, try to offer some more analysis. It seems to me that the bungling of the Secret Service is hard to just chalk up to, like, oh, they just weren't doing very well, they're incompetent. Um, and they did fire someone, I guess, right? But as a result of this, there's been
Mm-hmm.
some consequences. But it just depends on how cynical you want to be about the system. I wonder if in these positions that the people who are there as running it as figureheads, that they're basically people that are either compromised or that they just know will fall on their sword if asked to, that they can be persuaded to do whatever. So I don't think that the fact that someone was fired is actually that meaningful in this case. Like, oh, it was incompetence, and you see this person took responsibility for it, and move on now. It seemed that so inexplicably bad. I mean, so the logical conclusion is that these are some sort of anti-Trump plot involving the Secret Service on some level, or at least elements within the Secret Service to perhaps stand down. But then again, the guy seems like not someone that you would charge with this kind of a task. That you would have. Okay, we're going to allow you to get into place and then shoot. Just go ahead and assassinate the president, or not. Trump. Go ahead and assassinate Trump, and then that would be the guy they would pick. Although, I mean, if he was some kind of mind control experiment, or mind control subject, then maybe you figure if he doesn't succeed, he's going to get killed on the spot, and he looks so crazy that people will just think it was a lone nut. Alternatively, is it possible that there were other shooters around? That seems plausible to me,
Mm.
because he seems more, if you were going to have an assassination plot involving that guy, and with his shooting skills and so on, and the rifle and the distance, that you would really want it to be, that you would really want him to be like a patsy, and that you'd want to make sure Trump was killed by somebody who had a better shot, a better position to shoot from, and was a better shot, and could basically rely on the other guy to draw the attention and be the patsy. So, but I haven't seen anything that really I haven't spent a lot of time looking into it, but I haven't seen anything that suggests that that was the case. So I don't know. He could have been a lone nut. He could have been mind control subject. He could have been part of a plot to assassinate Trump. I mean, he could have conceivably been part of a pro-Trump sort of plot to have a spectacle that would help Trump, because that's what ended up happening. But even that seems kind of far-fetched to me. So I don't think that's very likely. And the one thing that I can say for sure is that if it is any sort of clandestine plot, we're not likely to get to the bottom of it, unless maybe because Trump could attain the presidency, perhaps he could have a way to get to the bottom of that. But I don't know that he could, even if he wanted to. I'm not sure. I mean, Richard Nixon could not get Richard Helms to give him the JFK assassination files. And he even said, like, I want to know, was it the CIA? Don't worry, I'll protect you, but I just need to know, because, this might become a political issue, and I would just like to be there to protect you, But he was really worried he really wanted some leverage over the CIA. And as it turns out later, the CIA kind of screws him with Watergate. So he was right to be paranoid. But the point is that the president, as much as anyone, almost seems to exist in the Hall of Mirrors. I think the way that he is briefed and given access to some facts that the CIA wants. I mean, the CIA or national intelligence agencies, they're supposed to be basically defining reality for the president. It's not like the president is sitting here listening to my podcast and like learning about the world that way. He gets his information from like the CIA podcast every day, or the president's daily brief, or whatever. So it's a very curated world that he has to exist in as he makes these decisions. And so, what do you do with that? So as for Trump, could he get to the bottom of this or not as president, or what really should we make of it? I think they're going to beef up the security on him. It's interesting that very shortly after it happens, Biden drops out. To what extent was that related in one way or another? I don't know. I have misgivings. I am no fan of Trump at all. And he seems as though he has some very pro-Israel backers, even as he's calling for kind of America first in a way. He's also, he's getting $100 million from the Adelson family, who are like ultra right-wing Zionists who spring for all those birthright tours, so that if you're a Jewish high school kid, you can go to Israel and see your birthright, which is like so horrific when you stop and think about it. But it's what Trump, it seems like when Trump took that money from the similar people in the first time around, he pulled the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal, and he moved the embassy to Jerusalem, the U.S. embassy, which were pipe dreams of the neocon right. Even though he's supposed to be the anti-neocon, he's actually super neocon in some ways. And then now they're saying, this was written up, I think, in the Forward, which is a Jewish publication. They're writing that the money that Adelson is giving Trump may be in the hopes that Trump will sanctify Israel's annexation of the West Bank. If that's real, so if Trump is frightening to me. Would he want to go to war with Iran? Would he let the U.S. participate in an Israel-Iran war? He seems dangerous to me, even if his rhetoric is sometimes better on Ukraine. Could he really get peace there on terms that would be acceptable to the American establishment? I don't know. So ultimately, I don't know what to make of the assassination attempt, and I can't say precisely what he's trying to do in a second term, but I know that I'm not optimistic about his prospects to do good things.
I know he's we have these quotes of personality and whatnot, and these enigmatic figures, but to me, I was more surprised by after the shots, where like, is it natural for someone to basically like hold their fist up in the air like that? And it seemed like that even afterwards, like, why would you allow him to be able to just get back up again, and do that? Wouldn't you think that there would be someone else, possibly that's still an active threat? Like, to me, that doesn't seem like a natural reaction to something like your life getting taken away, possibly, and then you like do that. I mean, this is crazy to me. But I mean, it is Trump at the end of the day, but it seemed just surprising the whole setup did. And then the fact that no one's really even talking about it like you think that they would, it's like just let's shift over to Kamala. And or even the J6 stuff. No one's even talking about the J6 stuff that the Democrats kept bringing up over and over, this impeachment and everything else. And it's like that's not even talked about now.
Yeah, I mean the January 6th stuff is I'm not any fan of Trump or the MAGA people or the QAnon people or the different elements of the January 6th, on the fringes or actually, center stage there. But I there's a lot of evidence that suggests, points to the conclusion that there were agents provocateurs active that day, and it would seem difficult to explain a lot of the things that happened without reference to that.
Hmm.
And then the fact that it was used so much to like as some sort of magic bullet against Trump to take out his candidacy, to just say, oh, these people on January 6th, oh my God, this is the worst thing ever. It's an insurrection. And it seems that most of the violence that they said was ended up being kind of like not. It didn't happen the way that they initially said. They weren't going around some mob like dismembering, security officials or anything like that. Like they were mostly, kind of. I guess they were guilty of kind of vandalism and trespassing and so on, but they were mostly like just kind of it was like a stupid riot or something. I don't even know how to describe it.
I mean, people from what I saw, people are pretty much just walking in. I mean, it just it seemed like an operation to me. Just to allow that many people to climb a fucking like a government like
Yeah.
building, and people just climbing on that. It looked like a movie set. I was telling my son, I was like, it don't even. It seemed like we're living in just a simulation.
Yeah.
Um,
And the bombs, there are these weird stories about bombs that were discovered, pipe bombs that were discovered, but then you find out that the people Wikipedia on January 6th stuff because I kind of wait for someone else to like really go over these things because I'm more interested in kind of big picture historical analysis. But everything about the January 6th thing, and the more that I've learned about it, it just seems like some sort of deep state spectacle in some ways. Like people want to elide the fact that there's a lot of reason, there's plenty of reason to be skeptical of our electoral systems and the election systems in the United States and the outcomes that they give us. These votes are often tabulated on machinery that is owned by private corporations, and the inner workings of them are trade secrets that they don't even have to explain, and they don't really produce an auditable recount in many cases. Like there's a lot of reason that Trump might have taken steps to deal with an election that he may have had reason to suspect was not on the up and up. And they know that these elections aren't on the up and up because they don't take any steps to actually remedy these flaws, these technical flaws within the system. And the logical conclusion is that they want these elections to be insecure because they want
mhm.
them to be stealable. I mean, that to me seems pretty clear. And Trump is, in that case, he's kind of correct about it, even though I think that like their analysis of it is all wrong. I mean, I think they try to blame a lot of things on voter fraud and on like Black and Latino people voting 100 times and stuff like that, things that don't really have much basis in reality. But the truth of it is that our elections are very insecure, and we should be looking to drastically and radically overhaul the whole system into some standardized thing that experts could say, with reason, that this system could not be more secure and more tamper proof, more fraud proof than we have done. We've taken every step to make this as fraud free and tamper proof as possible, and they simply have not, and they will not. And that should tell us a lot. But we already know that if set people are elected that they don't like, they'll assassinate them. So there's every reason to believe that this regime would not tolerate actually free and fair elections if they could avoid it. Because if they do, then they might have to assassinate more people, and then it could get messy. And best just to have these electoral systems that are vulnerable to manipulation.
Well, Aaron, I tell you, I wish we could talk a little bit longer, but this has been a wonderful episode 129. I think we covered a lot of topics. Really went into the Cold War stuff. I really appreciated that analysis because um, this book is very much it take you have to take your time to read it. I think this is political science, and I know that the parts about Watergate, I really had to sit down because I didn't know much about Watergate going
It's
into this reading.
confusing. It's very confusing.
Yes, and
I know a little bit more about Watergate, and so maybe at some point, maybe in a couple months or something, I could come back and tell you about it. But the short answer is, I now believe more firmly that in all likelihood, James Angleton put together those Watergate burglars, and that the intention was to get them arrested in a way to have more leverage over not just Nixon but other forces in the U.S. political system. So next time we can talk about that, perhaps.
I think that's a great idea. That'll give me a little bit of time to get a general idea because it's a long process. That's also something that is great because I always emphasize on this show the generational gaps that there are, and my kids and my generation have a distancing from a lot of those events, and I think it's easy to forget those things. But we have to always contextualize this continuum of deep state operations, and just these things can't be viewed as like separate instances or anything like that. They had to be viewed as almost a continuum because we know that now it seems like these events happen so quickly. I mean, what's going to happen this weekend? We don't know, but that's how quick the 24-hour news cycle has facilitated this process. I mean, everything is for the world to see now. Well, at least what we're allowed to see, we can see it, and then we're sure that there's lots of players behind the scenes that already know that these things are going to happen or can anticipate it a lot easier than the general public. But sure, I definitely like that idea of coming back on to discuss Watergate in the detail. I think my audience would definitely appreciate that. But are there any final words do you have for my audience today? And again, I want to say thanks for coming on to the show, and we can't wait to have you back on.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. I do. I try to take on the interview requests that I get as much as I can. So I'm happy to talk to you and to your audience. And I appreciate what you're doing here because even though we have very little political power to influence events in the democratic way that we're supposed to, we do still have pockets where there's free speech and where we can speak the truth. And I think that there's a power to that. And so I appreciate what you're trying to do here. And for people who want to follow my work, there's a YouTube American Exception channel. And we do put out something once a week. We have something coming today about the murders of Ferguson activists, actually. And there's the best way to support me is to subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. And we have 180, over 180 episodes there, including an oral history series with Peter Dale Scott, who's like the best and most prolific chronicler of the deep state, going all the way back to the 60s he started, and then through 9/11 and so on. And he's still around today, 95 years old, doing interviews with me. It's really great. And we have a recent series we did on Far West and the global drug meta group, dealing with the connections between drug trafficking and terrorist networks and the U.S. Western imperialism, essentially. So I think people could find that interesting. And basically, because I'm too radical for the academy after I got my doctorate and got my book published, I realized that the podcasting venture was really what I needed to do because there's no institutional support. So I just rely on support from people who subscribe to my podcast. And it's like I have a taco stand, except instead of selling tacos, I sell podcast subscriptions. And I'm happy to be able to do it because I've really enjoyed it. I guess I talk to great people that I admire all the time. So anyway, there's a lot more of my work there. Lots of stuff on JFK assassination as well, and just U.S. imperialism in general. And we also have a documentary coming out based on my work, on my book, which I think we're going to call it The American Exception, although I'm a little ambivalent about the title, but we'll see. I think that's probably what it's going to be. And just to clarify, the exception is that the U.S. Regime operates in an exceptionalist way, meaning that they are an exception to the rule of law. They make themselves an exception, put themselves above the law, and in that way, they operate in a permanent state of exception to the rule of law. It's become institutionalized, and that's really the focus of what I want people to understand is the lawlessness of this system of governance that we live under. And I think it's important. And if you find this, what I said today, interesting, you'd like the book, you'd like the podcast. And I'm glad that you have a platform for people outside of the corporate mainstream, Kiko. So thanks a lot.
Well, I think that's where me, Matt's still more or less embedded in academia, but we share that sentiment in common because during the process of writing my dissertation, I had conflicts even when I was trying to finish up my dissertation with what's going to be my next move, basically, because I don't know if this stuff is going to be receptive in my circles. And I've shown this stuff to colleagues. They've seen some of the work, and some like it and some probably don't. But they're probably not going to say it in my face because we pretty cool with each other. But you definitely feel that there's a lot of resistance in academia to this type of discussion that we're having today. And I don't even feel like it's that confrontational personally, but it's a part of the system. Academia is a part of this system, this superstructure, I guess, that kind of limits what you can do once you get into academia. You can't really voice dissent. You become a part of the system. And I'm sure that we can maybe touch on that too the next time we talk. But again, just thanks for coming on to the show. Share the information with your audience. I will share it with mine. Subscribe to Kiko's Freethinkers Forum for free on YouTube. Just take a little bit of time to expand your mind without spending a dime. And remember, you can't unthink free thought. Thanks again for coming up to the show, Aaron, and we'll talk to you soon. Cheers, everybody.
All right. Thank you very much. Peace.